Buenos dias. My name is Craig, and I'm trying to reduce suffering in product development. Let's get started. As usual, I'll briefly start off with a review of what I've covered in the previous keynotes. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and HR update, and then I'm going to focus on the main point of this talk, which is myths of software management, this time focusing on the myth of Conway's law. The first LeSS conference happened in Amsterdam in 2016, and the focus of what I shared was own versus rent. And I've learned over the decades this is a key idea for successful change, and not only in an organization, but even working with your significant partners and your children. If you want change to happen, the person has to own and want the change. They can't be pushed into change. And the most common mistake that I see amongst change agents is they teach what, or they teach how, instead of focusing on the important thing, which is why and how can the people want the change. Because if you don't solve that problem, there's no point about introducing LeSS or Scrum or whatever. So I encourage people to focus more on this psychological aspect of what is involved in making people want whatever the change is. The second conference was in London, and I shared a number of techniques in LeSS that can help. If you've read the first two LeSS books, you'll know that they're organized into thinking tools, the first section, then organizational tools, and then the second book is action tools. And so we have a world of these, and we explored some of these, for example, multi-team product backlog refinement. The third LeSS conference was in New York, and I explored some of the cognitive biases that we people have from evolution and how that can impact what goes on at work. The next conference was in Munich, and Elinor Ostrom is the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and she studied societies that have some shared commons, which could be a shared piece of land for grazing or a shared water resource for fishing. And how do the people, what are the patterns of how they've learned over the hundreds of years to work together when there's something shared? And then I explored the connection of that to commons in software development, the most important of which is shared code, and exploring some of the patterns that Ostrom discovered in the analysis of societies and commons and their connection to shared code, which of course is an important thing in scaling. 2020, I guess probably reading this is faster than me saying it. So in 2020, I tried to signal and communicate to people that GPT and AI is going to be really important and disruptive and is going to eventually have an influence on the interest in organizational systems such as LeSS, because where AI is heading us and where LeSS already is has an interesting intersection point. 2021 was in Prague, and before I briefly summarize, in Prague, we rented a place that had something like this. Beautiful, unless it rains. And the first day of the conference, when I'm giving my talk, boom, 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 and you could hardly hear anything in the hall. It's an example of the kinds of things you just don't think about when you set up these conferences. But it was a lovely city and a lovely time. And there, So part of my background is in mathematics and statistics. I used to be at a university in the statistics support department, coaching professors in the design of experiments and statistical analysis. So it's a world I know well. And when you look at the proof of any treatment, it's not possible to truly identify causality through case studies or correlation studies. Really, the only way that you can identify causality, whether some treatment actually has an effect, is through large randomized controlled trials. That's a fact. And then if you ask the question, how much management advice is based upon statistically significant randomized controlled trials, the answer is almost zero. In other words, the vast amount of management books we read and things you learn in universities is not grounded in hard research and evidence. And it's really, therefore, no better than astrology. And so I want to give people I'd like everybody to have real suspicion about so-called management advice. And I encourage you to think like a statistician or a mathematician and ask the question, what is the strong statistical evidence based upon randomized controlled trials for this bit of management advice that you're giving? And you'll virtually never find it. 2022, I touched upon the question of co-location. Please read this. Humans are humans, and to ignore human psychology in the context of things like remote or together, to ignore human psychology and the millions of years that we evolved in small hunter-gatherer tribes and our whole body, brain, emotional systems that were meant to connect with people physically close, to just naively say, oh, that's not so important, we can all create really strongly emotionally gelled teams over Zoom. Well, maybe, but I'd like to encourage us to have pause about that when you really consider human psychology. However, that said, I do think this problem will become solved probably through augmented reality technology. And then in the LeSS 2035 talk, I'm not here and you're not here. And it doesn't matter because we've fooled our brains. 2023 was in Berlin, and once again, I double-clicked on the message of AI and what its implications were going to be for HR, org design, and so forth. And that takes us to here and now. I briefly want to give an update with respect to AI and HR, and then move on to the main topic. This will just be short and sweet. First of all, this is not a new bandwagon for me. I'm not jumping on the AI discussion because it's something I've recently heard about. My undergraduate and graduate degrees in computer science, my specialty from the late 1970s is AI. This has been my passion since I was a young person. And I've always viewed, since the 1970s, that at some point AI is going to have a huge disruptive impact. I never thought we would be where we are today, but here we are. And so this is a very long interest of mine. Another comment I've made before is that I'm not talking about the state of the tools today. I've said for some years, 2027 is the earliest time, the end of 2027, the earliest time that we can fairly evaluate the impact that these tools might be having. It's too early at the moment. And we're in a decade of explosive growth. This is related to my comment on this last slide. Because we've got this explosive growth accelerating, and I'm choosing that word carefully, accelerating, the implications are, really quite astonishing. So we have a further acceleration, at least for the next couple of years. So let's wait until 2027 before companies make conclusions about the impact of AI. And why have I highlighted this and the connection between AI and org design? So here's the basic argument that I was making in my previous keynotes. Software, computers, they support automation. And 1, 2, 3 are the kinds of automation that I've been involved in my career in software development, and you have as well. And now, with the advent of robust AI, we're starting to also automate routine expertise. And that's what's going on now. What are forms of routine expertise? Here's a list of various single specialist roles in software development. And you could generalize the potential capabilities of AI this way. If it's been written down, if it's in any video, if it's in any audio recording, if it's in any book, if it's in any corpus of human knowledge, AIs will know it, and they will know it better than any human, either already or very soon. And the implication of that is that every one of these roles can better be done by an AI than a human. This is coming soon. All of this is routine knowledge. And so the implication of that is this. And then that, of course, starts to raise the question, why do we have these roles and these people, since we now have AIs which faster, better, cheaper can do this work? That's what I think is going to be the coming question in businesses over the next 10 to 15 years. And in last year's talk, I did some exploring and generated this table of some data from a brief exploration. Please take a moment to get your head around that. GLAD developer stands for Generative AI and LLM Assisted Developer. So, simplifying and rounding to those ratios of impact, notice how significant the impact is. In other words, we're not talking about a 20% productivity improvement in coming years. We're talking about orders of magnitude productivity improvement, and not even just 100%, but 1,000% or 10,000%. And we humans just have no concept of how this can impact organizations and their designs. Also last year, Goiko gave a keynote at the talk, and I've known Goiko for 20 years. He's the creator of many wonderful ideas, spec by example, impact mapping, and on and on. And I had a coffee with Goiko in Berlin last year. He's also a serial entrepreneur who creates a software product and then sells off the company and then makes another software product. He told me a story, and I might have the facts a little bit wrong, but it's sort of in this range. He had a previous software product that he created and supported and so forth, and it grew successfully. And he required around 5 other people, 5 other employees, to help him with all of the activities for this software product, from customer support to etc. He sold off that company, and then he started a new software product a couple of years ago. And Goiko is a very bright and very innovative guy. So he immediately, for the new software product, started to use AI tools to help him with his tasks. His prior company required, let's say, 5 employees. His new company, how many employees? 0. Goiko is able to comfortably do the work that was previously being done by 5 people with him and AIs. And that's a profound productivity change, orders of magnitude, not 20% or something trivial like that. So this is the main point that I was making in the keynote last year. Please read this. And since any or many average people will be able to use these tools to do UIs, to do product management, to do database design, to do coding, to generate the test, to refactor the code, all with very low learning effort, way faster, better, cheaper with these AIs, I suggest that that will, and this is the key point, therefore lead to the reduction of single specialists. Why do I need a single specialist database designer when 10,000 different regular developers can just type in, please generate a SQL database for e-commerce, and 5 seconds later it's done? Why do we need a database designer when that's the case? And on and on. And so I predict that this is going to create an influence towards the reduction of single specialists and an influence towards multi-learning developers that are doing multiple specializations leveraging AI tools. And therefore, the concept product market fit of LeSS and the impact of AI is an excellent fit. So we have this LeSS market opportunity to improve the world of work, because where AI is taking us in terms of the future roles of people, which is multi-learning, flexible developers, product developers, this is, of course, where LeSS already is. So I think of LeSS as already being there, and through the influence of AI, organizations are increasingly see the value of something like that that fits an AI-centric world. That concludes my summary, and now we're going to move on to the main event. Gosh, you could make a long list. And when I started to create this talk, I optimistically thought, oh, maybe I can cover 3 myths or 4 myths. But I started the first one. The first one took so long, I said, okay, that's enough for this year. So maybe in a future year we'll cover some others. And the one I decided to focus on this year in the myths of software management is Conway's Law. And I'm sure that most of you have heard of Conway's Law. And it's okay if you haven't, because I'll be explaining what it's about. And this is strongly related to scaling with multiple teams, because Conway's Law, as we will see, has been misused to justify certain large-scale organizational designs. So it's very much in the wheelhouse of scaling and myths. First of all, I want to pop to a higher level and make an education comment. There are many management or agile ideas and a lot of misunderstanding of what they mean. Read the original. If you want to clear the fog, read the original. If you want to know what agile meant, don't go to McKinsey's website and read their summary. If you want to understand what Scrum meant, don't go to scrum.org or Scrum Alliance and read what they meant. Go get the 1986 paper from Takeuchi and Nonaka from Harvard Business Review and read that. You want to understand Conway's Law? Actually read the original paper, and on and on. So do our history research. A second high-level education comment I want to make, and this will be practical for almost everyone in the room, because every one of us works as coaches or educators in some way. I'll tell it through a story. Years ago, I was listening to a podcast where a neuroscientist was being interviewed, an author of many books. She's a really good both writer and scientist. And she, in this new book and in this interview, wanted to explain the correct modern understanding of brain topology. So what she did in this 45-minute podcast interview was she spent, here's the key point, the first 30 minutes talking about the old wrong understanding, until that was fully explained, and then she used the last 15 minutes to describe the new correct understanding. This is a terrible idea if you understand human psychology, because us humans have about 20 to 30 minutes worth of high attention in our brains on average. If you do psych research, it's hard for people to really pay close attention for around 30 minutes, and then it really drops off when you're listening to a talk or a lecture. So ironically, these professors at universities who even studied cognitive science have no idea about education psychology and how people learn. And so in the future, whenever you're giving a talk or you're coaching and you're trying to explain an idea that's been misunderstood, do not start off by talking about the misunderstanding. Like, for example, the only thing that I remember now from that 45-minute interview is the wrong thing. I can barely remember the correct thing. And that will happen. So in the future, whenever you've got a mistake, correct understanding teaching situation, do not start by teaching the mistake. Start by teaching the correct understanding and then wrap up with the misunderstanding because of humans' attention. And so let's do this with Conway's law. So for example, a typical maybe talk on Conway's law might go through a whole bunch of pages about the wrong understanding and then conclude with the correct understanding. Let's flip that. And Conway's law is relevant to large-scale org design and therefore very influential in organizational structure. That's its connection to my world, which is the world of large-scale org design. And not only do other educators have an incorrect way of teaching because they teach the wrong idea and then at the end they give the solution, it's the same thing in Conway's paper, which was written in 1968. I analyzed the paper. Please look at this. He has about 100 words at the end dedicated to his recommendation, the whole point of the paper, and the vast majority of it is just a discussion of the problem and his observations. So I bet many people who have read Conway's never even bother to get to the last paragraph where he gives his advice. So many people don't even know that Conway actually had a recommendation and advice. And that's the real point of his paper, was this advice that everyone seems to have missed. This is his advice at the very end of the paper. This is the only time that he actually makes a conclusion about what you should do given the problems that he identifies. I'm going to break this apart so you don't need to read this very carefully. But I scoured the paper, and these were the only sentences that I could find that were actually related to his advice of what to do. Let's look at that. Please read this. So before opening up the box on this, to summarize, Conway observes that the communications pathways between people will influence the architecture of the system. That's his observation. And so then he makes a perfectly logical conclusion, which is that we want to structure the organization according to the need for communication. A perfectly logical conclusion. Now, what is the need for communication if the system optimizing goal is either adaptiveness or value, or fast. And by the way, these are things that CEOs typically care about. And the answer is, the need is for cross-stack, cross-component, and cross-functional end-to-end need for communication. That's a strong, logical statement. If you want to be fast, focus on delivering value, or on adaptiveness, the communication pathways need to cover the whole rather than just little fragments. So right away, from this very first slide, you might, for example, have heard people say something like, Conway's law recommends component teams. I've actually heard people say that. First of all, I hope you now know that that's nonsense, that's not true. And in fact, if you take his first bit of advice, it leads to the exact opposite. Moving on, please read. So one conclusion that Conway makes is that the communication pathways of a development group will influence the architecture. But then he makes a very important point, which is like the main point of his article that seems to have gone over the heads of so many people. And it's this sentence: the design which occurs first is almost never the best possible. And so then he says, and so therefore, we need a flexible organization to support effective design. So this has got nothing to do with promoting component teams. He's saying we usually get the architecture wrong. And then he's saying if we lock in communication pathways and teams, if we lock those into the wrong architecture, that's unskillful, is what he's saying. And so therefore, we should not lock in groups and organizational design to the existing architecture because the existing architecture is flawed. He's suggesting that we decouple those things. And it's interesting how rare I hear people who talk about Conway's law explain this. But when you actually look at the sentences of what he's written and analyze them carefully, it's very clear that that's what his point is. So locking in teams around an imperfect architecture is undesirable. And what is a flexible organization? It's not coupled to the existing architecture and components. Please read. I know I'm repeating myself now from the prior slide, but I'm trying to double-click and highlight on this point. This is really the message of the paper. We get the architecture wrong, so don't lock in org structure to bad architecture. Or any architecture, because it should be evolving. Moving on, please read. So I think most of the people in this room understand the concept of an optimizing goal for an organizational system. Is the organization optimizing for low lead time, for adaptiveness, etc.? And when you, this is actually a broader tip, when you read various books, many management people and methodologists in the software world are unaware that there is a goal behind their advice, but they often aren't explicit or clear about that goal, and everything gets a bit muddy. But if you read between the lines and read these books, you can often discover what the optimizing goal is in the mind of the author or the coach. For example, there's the book Team Topologies, as I'm sure many of you are aware. If you actually start reading the book, rhetorical question, what are the authors making their optimizing goal? And the answer is reducing cognitive load. And then from making the optimizing goal, reducing cognitive load, then comes a bunch of advice about how to structure the organization. And my comment here is not about the goodness or badness of a goal, but that there is a goal, and the idea is to have an org design that's consistent with it. And we can see here that Conway is pointing to that he recommends a goal of flexible organization. And the reason why he wants flexible organization is that the architecture and design will be imperfect and should be evolving. By the way, if you have component number 3, and if you have component team number 3 and component team manager number 3, how easy is it to change the architecture that doesn't include component 3? Right? That's what he's essentially pointing to. Next, please read. I find it delightful that in 1968 he uses the words lean and flexible. You know, those are words that Bus and me and many of us have been using for decades in the more modern era. And, here he's touching upon rewards and incentives, but once again, notice Conway's repeating use of the word flexible. That's his message that so many people seem to be missing, that he's advocating for a flexible organization, not one locked into existing architecture. And incentives really matter. If you have, to repeat now, a manager of component team 3, and they're incentivized for that team to exist and do things, gonna be hard to eliminate the existing org design. Please read. So traditional PMI, PMO, resource management is therefore the exact opposite of what Conway is promoting. So to conclude, what's something that's consistent with Conway's advice? Sentence 1, that. Sentence 2, that. Sentence 3, that. So when you actually read slowly and analyze Conway's advice, he's advocating for the kinds of ideas that we're promoting in LeSS. Feature teams, shared code, multi-learning developers, all of this is consistent with the flexibility and not locking in teams to architecture that Conway is advocating. I know this is an incorrect way to say it, but Conway wants less, to simplify it if you actually read. I know that's an exaggeration, but that when you read carefully, that's the direction he's pointing us towards. And he's not at all. There's nothing in his advice that points to component teams of single specialists with private code. There's nothing in the paper that suggests anything like that. Quite the opposite. So if I were to summarize Conway's advice, so this is Craig's summary: evolving flexible architecture by flexible communication in a flexible organization. And this is, I repeat, his overarching concern, that we want to be able to change the architecture will be wrong, and therefore we need to decouple the organizational structure from the architectural structure. Please read. I'm making the point on this sentence. I've seen many people incorrectly misinterpret Conway, where they're saying, oh, Conway wants limited communication bandwidth, or something like that. I've heard things like that. That's the idea, and that what Conway is promoting, limited communication bandwidth. No, he's not promoting it. He's identifying that this is a constraint in how organizations behave, and that's absolutely true. This is somewhat related to Larman's law, culture follows structure. Structure is so influential on communication and many other aspects of the group. Moving on. Maybe to state the obvious, when Conway uses the word organization, he is talking about the structures, the group structures of the organization. And I repeat, structure is super influential on organizations. So, in the first part of this presentation, I tried to focus on the correct understanding rather than the misunderstanding, building on my prior comment about ed psychology. Now, let's wrap up with a few common misunderstandings, of course, which I've already alluded to. So, something has been created called the inverse Conway maneuver or the reverse Conway maneuver. Who in the room has heard of this term? Okay. And first of all, the current popular meaning of inverse Conway's maneuver is the opposite of the original meaning of inverse Conway's maneuver. So to make things even worse, the 2024 widespread meaning of ICM is the opposite of the original meaning of ICM, to show you that people just aren't reading the original and doing their homework. Let me show you. So, oh, and by the way, this is all related to, why do these distortions in language and these distortions in misunderstanding happen? Words and phrases are overloaded to mean the same as the status quo because of all of the forces promoting the status quo and the incentives for coaches and consultants to write books and give ideas that support the status quo. All right, so this is the original meaning of inverse Conway maneuver. I did a bit of historical research, and it was from an article written in 2011 from a couple of guys at ThoughtWorks. They came up with the name. And what they meant by inverse Conway's law was very simply, it means break down silos that constrain the team's ability to collaborate effectively. Well, great, that sounds fantastic. I'm completely for that. And so it's quite interesting that this original meaning has been distorted into something very different. Please read this. So this one amuses me because the two ThoughtWorks guys, who I guess didn't read the paper, they called it the inverse Conway maneuver, as though this was the opposite of what Conway was recommending. But no, Conway was recommending that. This, what people call the inverse Conway's maneuver, is the Conway maneuver. Conway's the one that wants this. It's the whole world of coaches and educators is so messed up on not understanding what people meant. I find it endlessly amusing. Now, some years later, someone wrote a book called Accelerate. And I'm guessing they didn't either read the ThoughtWorks original paper and they didn't read the Conway's paper, because then they even took the misunderstanding further. Let's look at the incorrect understanding of the inverse Conway maneuver in the book Accelerate. Please read this here. So, the bright sparks who wrote this book, they describe the inverse Conway maneuver as the goal is for your architecture to support the ability of the teams without requiring high bandwidth communication between teams. Where is that in Conway's paper? There's nothing even like that in Conway's paper. If anything, Conway was suggesting the exact opposite, breaking down silos that constrain the team's ability to collaborate effectively. What the heck has that got to do with an architecture to support the teams? What the heck has that got to do with lowering communication between the teams? Notice that these authors are just making stuff up. It's got nothing to do with the original ideas. And why do we not have the architecture supporting the ability of the teams? Because Conway makes clear the architecture will be wrong. And so we don't want to couple the teams to the architecture. We want flexible organization. Please read. And yet you will see coaches and YouTube videos and books describe this as though it was what Conway was advocating. Moving on. So then, a few years later, some people wrote a book called Team Topologies. And they introduced inverse Conway's law again, which they renamed reverse Conway's law. And again, I guess they didn't read the original paper. The reverse Conway maneuver should align the teams and the architecture in a manner that lowers cognitive load, minimizes dependency, and matches product direction. Where is that in Conway's paper? There's nothing like that in Conway's paper. So, making stuff up. Look how far away this idea is from what Conway's paper says. And this is a quote from the book. By applying reverse Conway maneuver, we can design our teams to match the required software architecture. The required software architecture. I can hardly think of a more ironic misunderstanding. Conway was saying, you can't have the correct architecture. So stop trying to couple teams to it. It will be wrong and you want it to evolve. And now we've got coaches and so-called experts communicating as though Conway was advocating design the correct architecture and then couple teams to it. Yow. Because the design which occurs first is almost never the best possible. The prevailing architecture may need to change. Therefore, flexibility of the organizational structure is important. Nothing to do with that. So we've seen this before. Therefore, to conclude, like you see in the book Team Topologies, any form of, quote, adjust your organization to match your target architecture is the opposite of Conway's point. Please read. All right. It's time for our table exercise as part of the talk. I shared one myth of software management related to large scale. I'm going to be starting a timer for 5 minutes soon. And the question for your table is, do you know of a second or third software management myth, especially related to scaling, that you've seen in your career that you know is actually a myth? It's widely said, but in fact is incorrect. Maybe some of you have seen some other myths. And the exercise for your team is going to be the question by talking with each other, what are some other myths? And then in 5 minutes, we're going to come back together and we'll share some of these, and then we'll move on to the closing. Please get together with your team and talk about myths of software management, especially related to scaling. Welcome back. Do the tables or teams have numbers? Or they just have names or are currently unnamed? Okay. I'm deciding how to do some random selection from the table, so I think I'll just point out a table. So table here, anything that you'd like to share about myths of software management? And if we have a roaming microphone that we can share, I don't know if we do.
Test. Thank you. So we have 2 myths, maybe. High resource utilization will lead to faster flow. And then we continue, this is kind of a myth, but then we continue on that also. The faster flow will get us to better products.
Yeah, all that it means is that you deliver shit faster. Okay, thank you. That was interesting. This table here, any myths that you'd like to share? We need a microphone. And if there aren't any, that's okay.
We discussed 2 myths. One is that culture first. So if you want to change, you have to change your culture first. And we believe that's a myth. We believe that the culture is...
A bit louder, Cesaro.
Also, we believe that the culture is a result of changing your organization design. So it's like not a good idea to try to change culture, leaving all the rest as is. So that's one. And the other myth is that people think if you want to be able to change direction at scale, then you have to have loosely or let's say decoupled teams. But this is like nonsense. If you want to change direction at scale, then your teams must be highly coupled. And this is a myth.
Thank you.
The decoupling is a myth.
Thank you. And again, these table choices are just random. Thank you. And this table here.
So our myth is isolation of teams accelerates development since it increases focus.
Okay. And was there a second one, or was that?
Well, we actually thought quite a while about that local optimization output is more important than global optimization outcome.
Ah, yeah. Wonderful, wonderful examples. I love them. We could keep on going, but that was just kind of fun. I suggest maybe when we go to our next break, taking all of your Post-its, and maybe there'll be some wall place that you can stick them all together. Maybe one of the organizers of the conference can point out a wall space where we could put them all and then have a nice big photo of all of the myths of misunderstanding. But I'll let you guys figure that out at the break. Okay. Closing. First of all, I'm on a LinkedIn. I'm a junior GLAD developer. And I'm not a sad developer, serial, archaic development. No, I'm a GLAD developer. Generative AI and LLM-assisted development. Done. Thank you for your time.